Hey, Seth. Seth, we lost Brad. I don't know where he went.
Okay. Sorry, that's...
Oh, that's you. You got it. Okay, thanks.
Dogs are squabbling over the treats today.
Testing the audio, we good?
Okay.
Welcome to a research presentation in the Computational Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, sponsored by the Faculty of Computing and Data Sciences. Today's speaker is Professor Maurice Lee. Dr. Lee is the Director of Undergraduate Studies and Professor of English at Boston University. His work situates literature at the crossroads of intellectual and cultural history. Maurice is currently studying how mass print culture and quantitative methods shape the relationship between numbers and aesthetics in 19th century American and British literature, a relationship that conditions current attitudes towards the digital humanities and accountability movements in education. Today he will be giving a talk entitled Literature by the Numbers, an Interdisciplinary Collaboration. Joining Dr. Lee is his collaborator, Brad Rittenhouse. Dr. Rittenhouse is a research data facilitator at Stanford University's Research Computing Center. He recently completed an NEH-ODH fellowship working on Archiviz, an Omeka plugin that creates knowledge graph interfaces for text collections. He's also interested in technical collaboration on interesting projects and problems. What contribution can humanities scholars make to an interdisciplinary research project? Dr. Lee and Dr. Rittenhouse will present examples from their most recent collaboration in the digital humanities. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lee and Dr. Rittenhouse.
Thank you. Hey, everyone. Hello, Brad, out there in Stanford. Today's talk is mainly focused on a project that Brad and I did using a corpus of Ralph Waldo Emerson's collected writings. And we're going to focus on the methods that we used in our analysis of Ralph Waldo Emerson's writings. We're going to talk a little bit about the findings, of course, and we'll also reflect a bit on what it was like for us to collaborate together. So we're going to kind of tell the story of this project, and we'll take turns as we go. We wanted to begin by talking about the origins of the project, and I'll speak from my perspective, and then Brad can speak to his. It really kind of came as a moment of serendipity. I've done some work in the digital humanities, not much. I'm more interested in the history of information and informatics and its relationship to literature and aesthetics. And I had a colleague who was editing a collection of essays on Ralph Waldo Emerson email me, and he said, "Would you like to contribute anything?" And I said, "No, I don't have anything to contribute right now." And then I was reading through some journals, and I saw some of Brad's work, and I heard about a project that he had done called the Too Much Information Project that was on 19th century American literature, among other things. And I had never met Brad, and I just cold called him and said, would you be interested in working on this project with me? And the reason that I was interested in doing a digital humanities project or a computational humanities project on Ralph Waldo Emerson is that, one, no one really had done much. And on our slide here we can see the history of Ralph Waldo Emerson and DH. In 1893, an English professor actually did a quantitative study of Emerson's writing. Or actually more accurately, his graduate students just went through and they counted the number of words in each of Emerson's sentences across an entire essay and then graphed it. And you can see the results here. Since then, there's been almost nothing done on Emerson from a quantitative perspective. And so I thought that that might be an interesting project to take up. One of the reasons for that is that for those of you who know Ralph Waldo Emerson, he's a 19th century literary figure and also a philosopher who's famous for celebrating inconsistency. He has a famous quote, a foolish inconsistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. And he often frustrates philosophers because he practices inconsistency. You can pull various quotes from his writings that will speak on the opposite side of various issues. And it can be a little frustrating because critics like myself can make virtually any claim about Emerson, adduce some kind of evidence from his writings and claim that that's his position or his beliefs. And it's very difficult to adjudicate the kind of conflicts that you can come across in Emerson studies. And I thought a quantitative approach might be one way to do it. Emerson's also interesting because he's a romantic thinker who's often celebrated for or in the history of Emerson criticism, was celebrated for a kind of animus towards science, towards empiricism, towards quantification and numbers. Since then, in the last 20 years, 30 years, people have actually started talking about Emerson's interest in science and how he found science generative, how Emerson was someone who actually began to bridge what we now call the two cultures divide. And so I thought Emerson would be an interesting figure to study from a quantitative perspective. Brad, do you want to talk about the origins of the project for you? Ooh, Brad, we're not getting your audio right now.
Sorry, yeah. As I said, my dogs were squabbling, so no one's crying, so I had myself on mute. So yeah, as you said, I think it was a cold email rather than a cold call, asking me to work on a project on Emerson, and it sounded interesting to me. It was, I think we decided kind of, and this is the way that it worked out, on a division of labor where I would be doing a lot of kind of the digital facilitation, and Mo would be doing most of the kind of subject specialist work. I do have a PhD in 19th century American literature. I focused more on Melville and Whitman. I obviously, as a 19th century Americanist, you have to deal with Emerson and read Emerson. But I certainly didn't go into the depths that Mo had gone into. So I was mostly interested in the project to allow him to ask the questions that he had about Emerson. So it was really interesting to me to just say, what questions do you want to ask? To be able to kind of translate those into quantitative methods, to be able to negotiate between, what were his wishes and what was possible, especially at the time. We gave a talk recently here at Stanford about this. A lot of the audience was people in my unit, which is research computing, so there were a lot of people from NASA and other kind of very technical places who were saying, well, why didn't you do this and why didn't you do that? They're a lot more up on the state of the art. That is, 5 years after we started this project. So, there's a lot of kind of reckoning to do with what's possible now versus what was possible then. So yeah, it was a really interesting opportunity to collaborate and to kind of step back from the subject specialist role and to try to really facilitate questions that Mo had and to work those out and to just build a collaboration where we could answer some interesting questions in a field that Mo said these tools were being underused.
Okay, thanks. So what our plan was basically to take all of Emerson's published writings and treat that as our corpus and see what kind of quantitative analysis we could subject it to. And the first challenge was forming a corpus, which in some ways shouldn't be as difficult as it turned out to be. Emerson had very strange compositional habits. He kept extensive journals. His journals take up something like, I think it's 16 meters on a library shelf. He journaled his entire life. Over the course of his life, he hand-created indexes to his journals at 3 different periods of time. Those indexes run to over 500 pages total. And so when it came time for him to write a lecture or write an essay, he would go to his journals, go to his indexes, and just compile everything. Sometimes the there are multiple versions of different essays that he's written. They appeared first as a lecture or as an article, and then appeared later in a collected edition. So we had to do some work to try to figure out what exactly belonged in the corpus, how to date it, how to essentially assign it metadata. And we ended up using the Fireside edition of Emerson's collected works, which is in the public domain. So we didn't. So that made the assemblage a lot easier. Brad did the kind of the quotidian cleaning of the corpus. We ended up excluding Emerson's poetry because we felt that was a different genre, and we didn't want to kind of muddy the sample that way. And so we ended up creating a corpus, and then we faced a second challenge, which is related to the metadata problem, which is how to organize it. My initial hopes for the project was to be able to track differences in Emerson's style and thought and ideas across time. And we very quickly figured out that that probably wasn't going to work because because of Emerson's compositional habits. An essay that was published in 1850 might be compiled from journal entries made in 1832, 1845, and then based on talks that he gave in the late 1840s. And so the idea of dating Emerson's texts are very difficult. And again, we excluded the poetry because we just figured it was a different genre. And Brad also made the really good point, I think, which is an excellent point, which is most of the big data literary quantitative projects that people have done tend to involve novels, because novels provide just such large samples of texts. But digital tools have a problem of reading things like perspective, reading things like irony, and in some ways Emerson's literary output, his prose, is expository. He's an essay writer primarily, and Brad thought that also was an advantage in some ways because the analytic tools we were using could be better suited for expository rather than fictional prose. Brad, do you want to talk about the mapping methods and sort of how you went about creating the analytic tools?
Yeah. So this got into when we were starting, as I was talking with Mo about the things that he wanted to explore. As he said, one of the things he was interested in was kind of looking at period and voice and potentially rooting out, Emerson's mental decline and when periods when people who were helping him compose as he was becoming less capable, trying to figure out if there were other voices that we could definitively identify, things like that. Some of you may be familiar, one of the large kind of landmark digital humanities case studies that people point to, the Agatha Christie case where people say like you could find quantitative markers of her dementia in her writing, and that's something that a lot of digital humanists shy away from, just as like psychologists shy away from diagnosing people at a distance. There are, I think, better tools now. As I was talking about, there are things that are possible now that weren't as possible then. I think there are better tools now for classification. So that might be something that would be more possible to do if we were to start this project today. But one of the things that I was really interested in then was using a tool called named entity recognition. And that's kind of the focus for a lot of the things that we do as we progress through this presentation. And basically what that is using a computer to pull out proper nouns is a good kind of overview of what it is, the people, places, things, all of the important entities. So we pull those out. It's kind of a building block process for doing other things. And we kind of apply a a relational filter to that. I believe what we did was we pulled out those named entities, and then we considered them to be related to each other if they were mentioned in the same paragraph as each other. So what you get is this long spreadsheet, basically, of two people pairs. So Emerson and, or not, Emerson doesn't really talk about himself, but like Bonaparte and Jesus. And I use those knowingly because we'll be talking about them in a little bit. And then Bonaparte and prophets we'll talk about also. And it becomes these really long, repetitive lists. I think the spreadsheet that we used was something like 1 million of these. And I know because I spent like 4 weeks or something like that going through them line by line to kind of clean them up. It was very time consuming. But at that point, you start to get these really detailed kind of aggregations, and it really gives you some insights. And I won't go into too much detail because I think that's what we're going to be going into here in a little bit. But you start to not just get, it sounds simplistic when you just say, oh, you just find who he's talking about. But when you start doing it over the course of an entire oeuvre, you start to get an idea of aggregations and the ways that he is repeatedly grouping people together, and start to get ideas of logics by which he's grouping people together. And with that, you can start to kind of get at kind of philosophies and logics that might not be apparent if you're not using this methodology to make inquiries into the text.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, and I should have mentioned one of the big challenges in understanding Emerson for scholars of literature is what are his intellectual influences. Emerson was a dedicated but also highly undisciplined reader. So we know that he checked out just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books. He owned hundreds and hundreds of books. He read some of them. He stopped, like most of us. Some of his purchases were aspirational. Sometimes he started a book and didn't finish it. Sometimes a very brief engagement with another thinker could leave a deep mark on him. And so when critics try to place Emerson's intellectual influences across his entire career, it's a project that is too big to conceptualize as an individual reader. You can read all of Emerson, as I have, and it'll take you years to do that, but then to try to figure out exactly how these intellectual influences relate to each other and how to keep them in proportion to each other is really difficult, which is why we thought this kind of quantitative approach might help. And so starting very basically, and again, this will seem very mundane, and it probably is, but it can be helpful to literary scholars. This is just a very simple list of the people that Emerson mentions most across his writings. These are just the raw numbers and the frequency. For Emerson scholars, much of this would be predictable, but there are also some surprises. Certain people jump out more than others. For instance, I was very surprised to see Hafiz, the Middle Eastern Persian poet, as high as he was. I was also surprised to see Edmund Burke, the conservative political philosopher, being as high as he was. This is the kind of information that can help drive research projects. And in fact, I went into our the Modern Language Association bibliography and looked at all of the articles on Emerson, all of the scholarship on Emerson, and you will find pairings of key words for Emerson in every single one of these figures, which is unsurprising, except there's no article out there on Burke and Emerson. That's an oversight that people have just missed over decades and decades of Emerson scholarship. And so this very basic technique can help open up research possibilities. You also just get a sense of what Emerson's influences are. They're very Western, they're very classical, but there are certain anomalies as well, and we'll talk about that in a bit here. Brad, do you want to talk a little bit about the tools that you use to kind of create these maps and the relationships between the entities?
Yeah, I guess I can use this a little bit to talk about failure.
Okay.
It's integral part in doing kind of digital humanities or computational humanities. So I have never been a research faculty. At this point, I was kind of a limited term I forget what my position was, actually. But I was at Georgia Tech. I was primarily administrative, but I had some research responsibilities, but like 99% of my time was administrative, and the research was in my free time, basically. But I was in a well-funded Mellon lab and was able to hire some undergrads to do some technical things. So I had some undergrads who were building some interfaces. A lot of this project was doing technical things, but then also trying to build interfaces so that Mo could not just kind of like take my word for what the data said, but so he could explore the data himself. So one of the things that we wanted to do, or one of our goals was to build a knowledge graph so that he could explore the numbers around these different entity relations. But as I was saying, that spreadsheet ends up being kind of millions of lines, and whenever that gets translated into connections among entities, it ends up being this big kind of spaghetti mess that you see here on the right. And computationally, that ends up being extremely expensive. I think this that you see on the right here is only a small fraction of the entities in Emerson. We were never able to computationally display all of the entities in Emerson. We went through a few different iterations of putting it on bigger and bigger machines, and just never found a machine that would, I mean, they exist, but I don't know. There are other issues. I won't bother you with them. But yeah, a lot of it is kind of trial and error and figuring out what things will work and how to answer the questions that you want to answer within kind of the technological confines that you find yourself in the present moment. So this knowledge graphing approach, which is something that I've used in a lot of my projects, was not something that was really feasible for what we were doing. I don't know if in this version of the presentation we talk about word embeddings. Mm-hmm. Do we have that later on, Mo, or should I talk?
Yeah, we talk a little bit about it.
Okay. So I'll just talk a little bit about that generally, but basically the kind of alternative route that we went through was doing word embeddings, which does something similar to this in that it will tell you, basically it maps a word space, which is basically the collection of the words, in this case the corpus of Emerson, and it will tell you the similarity of the usage of any two words is the way that we used it in our investigation. So it will tell you basically how similar in usage, for instance, Burke and Hafiz are in that word space. So rather than how connected they are, meaning in this knowledge graph that you're looking at, that would mean how often they're used in the same paragraph. In the word embedding, it would be how similarly used they are, which there are measurements for that. I won't go into that right now. That may take another 10 minutes to explain. But they're pretty similar quantitative measurements that can get you to pretty similar results. But yeah, nobody wants to try and sort through the kind of rat's nest that you see there on the right, and the computer couldn't. So we had to find a kind of alternate way to get at the questions that we were trying to answer.
I'll also add that anytime you're collaborating in a way that we did, it takes a lot of patience from both sides, but I think Brad had to exercise more patience than I did when it came time to do things like set me up on GitHub, which he really had. This is not something that people in my field use. He had to teach me how to do like really just basic instructions to use and explore some of the tools that he developed or that he applied. Once Brad was able to do that, thank you, Brad, I was able to kind of explore the corpus using various search terms, exploring various maps and using different word embeddings. And I found it really stimulating. And this is something that I would say to people in the humanities who might not have the technical expertise, is once you can find someone who will work with you on this, even when the analytic methods don't themselves have a kind of evidentiary power to them, even if you can't really demonstrate something quantitatively, looking at maps, playing with the word embedding features can really be a spur to creativity and can point out paths of inquiry that you never would have thought of before, and can help you pursue intuitions to a point where you can find some kind of in the data you can find evidentiary support for your claims, which is maybe what I'll move to now. So one thing that we found that was very interesting was we're trying to keep Emerson's intellectual influences in proportion to each other, because inevitably what happens is if you're interested in Kant, you will read Emerson and think, oh, he's very invested in Kant because I've found all these mentions of Kant in his writing. If you're interested in Napoleon, you will come to the same conclusion that Emerson is highly invested in Napoleon, and it's hard to know exactly how to keep them in proportion, which is why these frequencies helped. One thing that we also found, and this is using the relational models that Brad helped with, or that Brad applied, is that these are a very uniform set of thinkers, but there are a few anomalies among them. And so one thing that we found was that Emerson is an inveterate dropper of names, and he loves to list people. And when he mentions a major thinker, it often like opens up a floodgate where he'll mention a set of other thinkers, all in the same sentence or within the same paragraph. And that tendency is very much shown in the relational data. These people are all, anytime Plato is mentioned, it's very likely that other major thinkers will be mentioned. They tend to cluster, and the data showed that. But there were really three anomalies in this list of names that did not operate in that way. The first was Napoleon. And if you look at the list, all of these people are thinkers. They're intellectuals. And that's not what Napoleon is known for. He's a man of action. He's a military leader. Napoleon was most likely to be associated with names like Caesar or Admiral Nelson, who don't appear on this top 20 list. And so Napoleon sort of operates differently in Emerson's corpus, and the data shows that. The same is true for Hafez, who is a poet, but is also not coming from the same kind of European Western classical traditions that the rest of the list does. And so it's as if Emerson doesn't quite know what to do with Hafez. He doesn't know how to cluster him with other thinkers. When he says Aristotle, you're pretty sure Socrates is going to be mentioned in that same paragraph. If he says Carlyle, you're pretty sure that Swedenborg or Wordsworth is going to be mentioned in that same paragraph. So he has them clustered and mapped together. But Hafez is sort of like, Emerson doesn't quite know what to do with him. He's a bit of an anomaly. The most shocking was Jesus, where unlike every other named entity here, Jesus is almost never paired with other thinkers and even other named people, entities. And our software or the tool categorized Jesus as a person. But that's not how Emerson uses him. Jesus has a kind of transcendental or otherworldly sort of status in Emerson's oeuvre, which, and I won't belabor the point here, for people who are interested in 19th century theology, there was a big debate that Emerson was invested in about whether Jesus should be regarded as a man, or whether he should be regarded as a kind of supernatural being, or whether he should be regarded as kind of both. Emerson definitely seems to treat Jesus not as a man, but as someone in a different domain, a different category altogether. So that was some useful data that we found. This is to switch gears just a little bit, and I want to make sure we're mindful of time. Another entity that we mapped was not people, but geographic and geopolitical entities. And just again to give you a background of how this can be useful to humanities scholars, Emerson was long regarded, when people first started studying Emerson, he was known as a man of Concord or a man of Boston, very much associated with New England. And then he became conscripted into a more nationalistic movement, and he became a great American figure, the father, one of the fathers of American literature. And then about 20 or 30 years ago, people started wanting to break away from that paradigm and started thinking of Emerson as more of a global thinker, more of someone interested in world and international events. And so Emerson, how to think of Emerson spatially has been a question in the field. No one's ever gone and just mapped the places that Emerson refers to in his writings, and Brad went ahead and did that. And one thing you can go. We don't have the visuals for all of these, but the software or the program allows us to kind of drill down at various levels of scale. One thing that became very clear is that the vast majority of Emerson's references are to New England and Western Europe, and you can see kind of the heat map here for Emerson's place references. This can help us, again, keep claims about Emerson in proportion, understand claims about Emerson in proportion to each other. One thing we also found that was interesting was that when Emerson mentions places with which he is familiar, and I guess this shouldn't come as a surprise, but when he mentions England, but he also mentions lots of specific place names within England, specific cities, specific counties. When he mentions other places like Asia or Africa, he almost never mentions specific place names. It suggests that he doesn't have a deep understanding or interest in those places to the same degree that he does for Europe. And actually, one of the interesting findings was when Emerson spent significant time in Italy, Scotland, Ireland, and England. In for all of those countries, he mentions lots of specific cities, lots of specific locations. When he talks about France, he only mentions Paris, because that's the only place he ever visited. He went to France twice, but was never outside of Paris. And so again, one of the things that is I think maybe nice and maybe too nice or convenient about digital humanities approaches or computational approaches is when your data says something that you expect, you say, oh good, my model works, my model is accurate. And when the data says something that you don't expect, you say, oh good, I'm learning something new. I think for the geographic data, it confirmed an older sense of Emerson as someone who's really more focused on New England and Western Europe than he is the broader global environment, which is not to say he's not interested in global issues. It's just, again, to keep things in proportion. Brad, did you want to add anything about this?
Just say for me, and this probably just speaks more to my ignorance of Emerson than anything, but for me, I always thought of this generation of American writers as a generation that was more cosmopolitan, that did speak more about the outside world, that talked about Mohammedans and Hindus and things like that in a way that's funnily archaic, but remarkable for being more focused on the world stage. So to see how focused quantitatively he actually is on New England and Western Europe, it did kind of go against my expectations that he would be more world conscious than ended up being the case.
Yeah, I would say the same thing for me. I'll share one more finding because I want to be mindful of time. It's very much too small to read, but on the left is a list of all the different Emerson texts in his corpus. And on the right is the density of entities in that corpus. And one thing that we found that was surprising is that Emerson's canonical texts, the essays that people read the most, the essays that people write about the most, that they are most often or more likely to teach, and that are most likely to be anthologized, tend to have the lowest density rate. And so one way to think about this is of the 160, is that right, Brad? I think it's...
It was 129.
129. Of the 129 individual texts in the corpus, 30 of those are essays that Emerson collected in his three major books, Essays 1, Series 1, Essay Series 2, and Conduct of Life. These are the most canonical of Emerson's essays. Of those 30 texts, 28 of them fall below the median in terms of density. And of the 10 least dense texts in the corpus, 8 of those come from the 30 canonical essays, which suggests that the Emerson that we know and that we emphasize is an Emerson who doesn't refer to specific people, specific places, specific organizations. It's an Emerson who's very abstract, who's very conceptual, who's very much transcendental. And this data can help remind us that Emerson wrote lots of other texts that are very much more into the specific details of the world and are less transcendental than the Emerson that we tend to focus on. And that was borne out in these findings as well. Our final sort of topic here is really focused on collaboration. And we talked a little bit about the technical disparities. Something else we should mention is we did this remotely. Brad was initially at Georgia Tech. I was in Boston. Part of this was during the pandemic. And we did all of this over Zoom or remotely. How did that work for you, Brad?
I mean, I'm really impressed with what we were able to do through all of that. It was a hard time for me, personally. I'm sure it wasn't, the best time of your life. But yeah, I think it was it ended up being a really impressive project. But, yeah, I think considerably more difficulties than we would have faced otherwise. So yeah.
Yeah, and it was great when we finally did give that talk at Stanford. We got to meet each other after kind of working remotely for quite a while. I did think it hampered us a bit, and I do know that when it came time to when Brad was trying to get me going on GitHub, for instance, if we were in the same room, he could have just taken my computer and done it. But he had to really talk me through it. So that was one challenge. As I mentioned, the technical disparities were a challenge as well. I'll also say a little bit about disciplinary differences. We put it there twice, I guess, because it matters so much. As mentioned, Brad did his PhD in American literature, so we did not have to sort of jump huge chasms between our understanding and our approaches. But I will say that and this is something we've only kind of talked about a little bit, is Brad helped keep me in check a little bit. I think his background in data science and his understanding of how data works, I was often too quick to find sort of small amounts of data supporting something that I wanted to say, and then Brad would have to kind of talk me down a little bit and remind me that it was a very small sample size, or that in comparison to other potential connections or relations, this really didn't have a kind of quantitative authority to it. So I think literary critics, and I don't want to speak too broadly about my discipline, we often operate by intuition. We often privilege counterintuitive claims. I think this is true of a lot of disciplines. And this is a particular danger for Emerson, as I mentioned at the outset, that because he says so many different things, it's very possible to find evidence to support all sorts of claims about him. And the data really helps, I think, ground claims and gives them a sort of rigor that we don't normally have in the field. But that only works as if you have somebody who is also a rigorous thinker and is using the data responsibly. And I think Brad was more likely to do that than me. What do you think, Brad?
I'm not sure if I have anything to say directly to that, but I was thinking about disciplinary differences, and I think right now there's never been a better time for that. When I was starting, if you didn't have, and you needed more technical skills than you do now because there weren't as many tools available and they were harder to use. So if you didn't have those skills, you needed to find usually someone in computer science to help you execute a project. And then there's a very large disciplinary gap to overcome. But now, if you don't have technical skills, there are a lot of people in the humanities or in your specific field in the humanities who are looking to collaborate, who can help to execute projects that you're interested in. And I think a lot of people, I mean, I always found it refreshing, to be able to just do the technical side, or to mostly do the technical side, and to let someone else do a lot of the kind of subject specialist side. A lot of people, for myself at least, I wasn't in a research position. I had a lot of other responsibilities. So to let Mo take the lead in many parts and to just kind of execute things that he needed, and not have to be in the lead and not have to kind of direct the research, it was kind of mutually beneficial, and it was not a hard ask for either of us because we both were speaking mostly the same language, being from the same discipline. So I think it's a really easy lift right now and moving into the future as compared to when I was starting to do this type of thing.
Okay. And maybe that's a good place to end. Brad said mutually beneficial, and that's how I feel too. And for people who are in the computational sciences and are interested in humanistic topics, I think there are lots of humanists with field specialty knowledge who would be interested in collaborating, and I'm one of them. And it really can be mutually beneficial. So we'll leave it at that and see if people have any questions.
I have a question to begin about the reception of this research among people in your field. I am aware that in English departments there's a bit of bafflement about these methods, and also some resistance, feeling as though it's oversimplifying, or it's doing some harm to some sacred element of the text in question. So I'm quite interested to see how you've navigated that. Could you describe the reactions and let us know how you've handled it?
Sure, I'll speak first and let Brad finish. The first thing I'll say, and this is maybe an additional disciplinary difference, is we're not really sure what the reaction is. We began this project as Brad said, 5 years ago. We submitted our manuscript to the essay collection 2 years ago. It is now forthcoming. And things move very slowly in the humanities. And one of the interesting things about the digital humanities in particular is the people who are really in the field and are really committed to it and define themselves in this field, they're often, they don't read journals so much as blogs. They're self-publishing because the way that knowledge distribution works in the humanities is painfully slow, particularly in comparison to the sciences. And so that's one answer to your question. We have I did present at a conference, a literary conference. I think what has happened in literary studies, and I think this is probably true for the digital humanities in general, is what has happened to a lot of new methods in the field, which is when a new method arrives, there's resistance, there's hand-wringing, there's skepticism, and the people who are first leading that sort of new method are often on a kind of island. But because the humanities are, in terms of method, tend to be kind of fuzzy, tend to be interdisciplinary, for better and for worse, the techniques just kind of gradually get adopted into the great Borg of humanistic study, and people become more accustomed to them. And so I don't think you get the same kind of hostile reaction that you used to get to quantitative approaches to the digital humanities work. I think there are people much more open to it, and even the people who don't do it, I think, recognize it now as having a kind of legitimacy, even if it's not something they themselves want to do. So I think that's like an optimistic view. I will say this, though. There is something fundamentally more challenging about quantitative approaches to literature than, say, something like, if you think about, and this is to speak in technical terms, within my specialty or within my discipline. So deconstruction comes, and that's like a kind of a new method. But that's essentially philosophy. That's something that literary people can deal with. Then there is something called new historicism sort of emerges. And, but that's a kind of a history, and that's something that humanists can deal with. And then there's canon expansion and culture wars, which is, we don't want to just read Shakespeare, we want to read texts by women and non-white people. Well, there's still novels and poems, and so that's easy to integrate into the field. The quantitative methods, I do think there was more resistance, and it still feels a little foreign to a lot of people. But it is sort of making its way into it is being integrated into the field more slowly than some of those other new methods across the history of the discipline. I'm going to leave it at that, except there's plenty of knee-jerk kind of anti-technical thinking everywhere, and it's maybe more prevalent in the humanities than some other disciplines. I don't know, Brad, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just say the only reaction that I've seen was when we presented at Stanford in a DH center, with people from that center and also people from my unit. Like I said, a lot of people who had previously worked at like NASA and Los Alamos and places like that. And, at least from them, who are people who did not study literature or had to take required courses in literature and probably usually hated it. For people like them, they're like, man, I wish I could have studied literature in this way. So I do think there's, a lot of opportunity in this. Maybe scholars don't like it that much, but it is, Mo talked about, things like post-colonialism and feminist readings and things like that, opening up the field in the canon. Like, this is another way, I think, of opening up literature to other people, and another way of dealing with different crises in the humanities that can, help stabilize our fields, not to be completely, mercenary about it, but it is a way of making literature legible to different people and making it relevant, and also bringing in skills that can scan on resumes and CVs. Sorry, this is like something that I'm doing right now.
Mm-hmm.
I have a fellowship that brings in humanities and social science graduate students who work on our high performance computing environment and do research in literature and philosophy and things like that. So I'm thinking a lot about kind of using technical skills in the humanities, but I don't want to sidetrack us that much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Another question. Given the way this video is going to be used, I think it's important for us to discuss the phrase digital humanities. Quite often we draw a sharp distinction between digital humanities and computational humanities, in that digital humanities has been database work, making material available to humanities scholars and so on. And computational humanities uses computational methods. But there are a few places where digital humanities is being offered as a kind of umbrella term for everything.
Yeah.
But we feel as though, around here at least, we felt as though it's stretching the term too far. It's failing to give honour to the digital humanities people for being the early adopters, and it's also failing to acknowledge the role of computational methods, which are very different than the methods digital humanities starts out with. But there's a case that can be made in either direction. Could you comment on your usage there?
Yeah, if I would have to go back and look at the tape, I've probably been slipping back and forth between the two terms a little bit, for the very reasons you described. So in literary studies, people who are really invested in the field recognize the difference between digital humanities and computational humanities, the very one that you mentioned. At the same time, some people will use digital humanities just as kind of a catch-all phrase. And I think particularly people who aren't invested in that sort of research will think of computational humanities as kind of digital humanities. But it is important to make that distinction, because obviously it's incredibly different to do something to do a project where you're putting up an unavailable manuscript in digital form and using Word2Vec to create word embeddings. I mean, those are like entirely different projects. And so, yeah, I think probably using more precise terms would be beneficial, as long as the listeners are themselves understand those distinctions. So I think that's a helpful correction. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your attendance. Good to see you, Brad.
Yeah, good to see you too.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.